No forced entry, no broken locks, no scratched door frames, no shattered glass. Yet a 2-year-old child vanished in the night. His parents were right there in the apartment. They just dozed off for a bit. When they woke up, the living room was intact. Everything looked like nothing had happened, except for one thing. The child was gone. If the door was never broken, how did the child disappear? Before we start the case, let me tell you where I followed this story. Friday, July 25th, 1997, Stafford County, Virginia. An ordinary summer weekend like any other, hot, humid, and tired in a way only those who've just worked all week understand. John Hill was just 21 years old. Leah Hill, 20. They were so young that, at a glance, people might mistake them for a couple fresh out of school. But in their small apartment at Stafford Lakes, they were already parents. That night was nothing special. No parties, no alcohol, no arguments. Just two young people trying to make the most of their rare, free time to breathe. They put on a videotape, a romantic movie that later became an odd detail in the file. Pretty Woman. Someone recounted that the little boy, Dakota, liked looking at Julia Roberts on screen, as if recognizing a familiar face. Leah was soothing the child while watching, John leaning back on the sofa, eyes heavy. The moment of just closing my eyes for a bit happens in every family, and it always starts harmlessly. Near dawn, the apartment sank into silence. All three slept right there in the living room, on the floor, blankets and pillows pulled together. Summer made everyone too lazy to get up and go to the bedroom. The TV turned off, or the tape ended. No one remembered exactly. The remaining sounds were just the air conditioner, the fridge humming softly, and outside, the apartment complex living its own rhythm. Occasional cars passing, a door closing, footsteps on the metal stairs. And then, morning came without warning. Leah woke up first. Maybe because of the heat, or because of an empty feeling hard to name, like the body knowing something was wrong before consciousness could understand. She sat up abruptly, hair messy, eyes stinging. By habit, her hand reached to the side, searching for the small body that usually curled up next to Mom. But her hand only touched the floor, colder than usual. "Dakota?" she called softly, voice still sleepy. No answer. No giggling. No little footsteps running around. Leah looked around. The living room was the same. Blankets scattered, pillows crooked, water glass on the table. John still lying there, breathing steadily. Everything so normal that, for the first few seconds, Leah reassured herself the child had just crawled to another corner or had snuck into the bedroom to play with toys. She stood up, walked quickly to the bedroom. Not there. Kitchen. Not there. Bathroom. Not there. The cold feeling running down her spine started from a very small detail. The apartment was too quiet. A 2-year-old? No. Matter how well behaved, rarely disappears without leaving any sound. Leah returned to the living room, shook John. "John, wake up. Dakota's not here." John rolled over, still dazed. "Where'd you put him?" he mumbled, as if this were a joke. "No, I've looked everywhere." That sentence worked like a slap. John bolted upright, eyes wide. He ran through the bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, then came back, face pale. They both started calling louder, at first calling, then calling like shouting, like begging. The child's name echoed through the thin walls of the apartment complex, then dissolved into silence. The moment that truly made them panic wasn't not seeing the child in the house. It was when John stood before the front door. The door was still closed. No pry marks, no scratches, no sign anyone had tried to break in. John placed his hand on the lock, looked at Leah as if wanting to ask, "Did you lock it?" Leah nodded, or at least she thought she had locked it. John tried turning. The door didn't open by itself like a broken door. It stood firm, solid, like silent evidence. And that very normalcy made everything illogical. If there was an intruder, the door must have marks. If someone carried the child away, there must have been noise. If Dakota went out by himself, a 2-year-old, how could he open the door? How could he get past the final barrier that adults still believed was safe? Leah felt her hands trembling. She looked down at the floor, as if she could find a clue there. A child's slipper, a toy, a drag mark. But there was nothing. John stepped into the hallway, calling his son's name. The echo returned empty. He ran down a few stairs, looked at the parking lot, looked at the space between buildings. Didn't see a child's shadow. Didn't hear crying. Leah stood in the doorway, heart pounding to the point of pain. She wanted to chase after him, but was afraid leaving the apartment would make things worse, as if Dakota might suddenly appear in some corner, just as she turned her back. They had only one truth in hand. The child had disappeared. The moment John and Leah accepted they couldn't solve this themselves came very quickly and very painfully. In the first minutes, they both tried to cling to the hope that Dakota was just somewhere very close. Maybe snuck into a neighbor's apartment, maybe followed someone down the stairs and would come back. But each time calling their son's name echoed without response, that hope shrank a little. Leah was the one who said it first. "We have to call the police." The sentence seemed obvious, but when spoken, it carried a different meaning. This situation had gone beyond their control. John picked up the phone, hands shaking so much he had to dial twice. When the other end answered, he tried to keep his voice calm, an almost impossible effort. "My son, 2 years old, can't find him anywhere." Just those few words were enough to make his voice break. The dispatcher asked for address, name, last time they saw, the child. The question sounded very mechanical, very procedural, but to John and Leah, each question was like a small knife, forcing them to admit the worst. While waiting for police to arrive, Leah knocked on each nearby apartment. A woman opened the door, still in her pajamas, face full of concern. "I didn't see anything," she said. "I haven't gone out this morning." Another said they heard noise on the stairs at dawn, but weren't sure what it was. Footsteps of adults or children, or just metal vibrating from the wind. Each piece of information was vague, not enough to hold on to. Police arrived fairly quickly. 1 car, then 2. Blue and red lights reflecting off the pale walls of the apartment complex, turning this place, once familiar and safe, into a strange scene. A police officer entered the apartment, asked John and Leah to recount from the beginning. Again, the same series of questions, but more detailed this time. What was Dakota wearing when he went to sleep? Does anyone else have a spare key? Was the door locked? They checked the front door, touched the lock, looked at the door frame. No signs of forced entry. Nothing unusual. The officer took notes, nodded slowly. "We'll examine all possibilities," he said. But his eyes, though trying to hide it, still revealed one thing. This situation wasn't simple. Some neighbors began gathering in the hallway. News spread very quickly in spaces like this. Some whispered to the person next to them. Some asked directly, "Was it a kidnapping?" The word kidnapping fell to the floor like a heavy object. Leah heard it and felt her stomach tighten. She wasn't ready for that word. She didn't want anyone to attach it to her family's story. Police asked John and Leah to sit in one place. They began asking questions every parent fears. Any recent conflicts with anyone? Has anyone threatened you? Has anyone shown excessive interest in the child? Those questions weren't accusatory, but they forced the listener to think in a frightening direction. Leah kept shaking her head. No, no one. This is a family neighborhood. Everyone knows each other. John nodded along, trying to stay calm. In his head, every memory of the past few days was turned upside down, searching for a stray detail, a strange look, an unusual comment. But nothing appeared clearly. Outside, more police arrived. Some began going floor by floor, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Dacota. The atmosphere in the apartment complex changed quickly. Neighbors who were once friendly now looked at each other with cautious eyes. The unspoken question hung in everyone's mind. If the child didn't leave on his own, then is someone among us involved? Leah sat on the sofa, both hands clasped together until white. She watched police come and go through her apartment, touching familiar objects, the chair, the table, the rug where her son usually played. Everything suddenly became potential evidence. That feeling of invasion made her want to scream, yet also want to cling to anyone who could bring her son back. A police officer asked again about the door. "You're sure you locked it?" Leah nodded, then paused. Was she sure? She remembered locking it, but that memory wasn't as sharp as she wanted, and that very vagueness frightened her. Could just one small mistake, one moment of carelessness, be enough to cause this? When the term missing child was mentioned officially, everything seemed to slow down. John heard it echo in his head, detached from reality, as if it were someone else's story. But then he looked at Leah, red eyes, pale face, and understood this wasn't a nightmare that would end when he woke up. Police began talking about next steps, expanding the search, notifying other units, gathering information from the entire apartment complex. Those technical terms flowed past John and Leah's ears without sticking much. The only thing they really heard was one thing: their son hadn't been found yet. And with it came the question that kept growing, heavier, more haunting with each passing minute. If Dacota didn't walk out on his own, if there were no signs of break-in, then someone, or something, happened right in their supposedly safest place. When the sun rose higher over the Stafford Lakes parking lot, the story of Dacota Hill was no longer just the Hill family's story. It spread in a very familiar way, from one person's mouth to another, from hallway to stairwell, from whispers to half-certain statements. And with that spread, an assumption began to form. No one officially declared it, but almost everyone thought of it. If the child didn't leave on his own, then perhaps someone had taken him. Police didn't say that, at least not yet. But the way they asked questions was enough to suggest that line of thinking. They asked about people who had visited the apartment. They asked if anyone had recently shown special interest in Dacota. They asked about strange cars, unfamiliar faces. Each question was like a pebble thrown into a calm pond, creating ripples spreading wide in John and Leah's minds. Leah began recalling very small details. A man she'd once seen standing smoking near the stairs. A car parked a bit longer than usual in the lot. A passing conversation with a neighbor that now, looking back, she wasn't sure she remembered correctly. Those memories weren't clear, but in this context, they suddenly became frightening. Outside, some neighbors had gathered in small groups. No one spoke loudly, but their eyes spoke instead. Some whispered, "These days, who knows?" Some shook their heads, faces serious. The word kidnapping was no longer avoided like at first. It appeared in half-finished sentences, in quick exchanged glances. John heard someone say, "If it was a stranger, they must have noticed beforehand." That statement sent chills down his spine. The thought that someone had been watching his son, right in the familiar apartment complex, was something he'd never allowed himself to think. But once the seed of doubt was planted, It was very hard to pull out. Police began expanding their questioning. They knocked on each apartment, not just asking if anyone saw Dacota, but asking questions that seemed unrelated. Who was home from last night until now? Who left for work early? Who was away for the weekend? Those questions, though necessary, inadvertently drew a map of suspicion. Each person became a point that could be examined. Leah realized something that frightened her more than anything. She was starting to look at people around her with different eyes. The woman who once borrowed sugar from her suddenly seemed distant. The man living alone downstairs, someone she only recognized by face but never talked to, suddenly became a question mark. Not because of any evidence, but because he was different. And in moments of panic, different often equals suspicious. A police officer asked John, "Do you have any grudges with anyone?" John shook his head. "No, we're just a normal family." He heard himself say that, and suddenly realized how fragile it was. Normal isn't armor. Normal doesn't protect anyone from the worst things. When FBI was mentioned, just mentioned, not yet appeared, the atmosphere grew another layer heavier. To John and Leah, FBI meant serious cases, TV stories they never thought would touch their lives. If things had gone that far, then perhaps the initial assumption was no longer just an assumption. A neighbor said they heard footsteps on their ceiling at dawn. "Sounded like a child running," she said, but then immediately added, "I'm not sure. Maybe I imagined it." Police took notes. John grabbed onto that detail like a thin thread, both hopeful and fearful. If it really was Dakota's footsteps, that meant his son had left the apartment. But if his son left, then why didn't anyone see him? Leah began feeling an invisible pressure weighing on her chest. No one said it, but she felt the looks from some neighbors when they looked at her, a look mixed with pity and questions. Could something have happened in that apartment that we don't know about? That thought made her dizzy. She wasn't just scared for her child. She was also scared for her own family, for how this story was being retold every minute. Police tried to keep their tone neutral. They kept repeating that all possibilities were being examined. But that very phrase, all possibilities, opened the door to the worst imagination. In John's head, scenarios appeared on their own, though he hated them. A stranger carrying Dacota away, a car leaving the lot in silence, an irreversible mistake. And so, in just a few hours, a missing child had turned into a story about someone. Someone was here. Someone did something. Someone is hiding something. No evidence needed, no official accusations, just fear big enough. John and Leah stood at the center of that storm, both victims and the center of all eyes. They didn't know if this assumption was right or wrong. They only knew that once people started looking for a person, the original question, how did the child disappear, was gradually being replaced by another, much more dangerous question. If someone took Dacota away, then who was that person? When the assumption that someone took Dacota began taking root, all eyes in Stafford Lakes gradually narrowed. No longer some stranger out there, but a very specific person very close. And in situations like this, silence always becomes the most frightening thing. There was one apartment police knocked on more than once. It was on the ground floor, door tightly closed. No one answered. Leah didn't remember clearly if she'd ever talked to that apartment's owner. She only remembered he lived alone, and usually didn't socialize much. A familiar face, but not close. On normal days, that meant nothing. But on a morning when a 2-year-old disappeared without a trace, that unfamiliarity immediately turned into a suspicious gap. Police asked the surrounding neighbors, "Where did he go?" One person said, "I think he went on vacation." Another wasn't sure. "I haven't seen his car for a few days." No one knew exactly, and that very vagueness made everything worse. John stood a few meters away, hearing each scattered answer. He didn't want to think about that apartment. He didn't want to attach any specific face to his fear. But the human brain doesn't work fairly when pushed to the limit. It seeks order in chaos. And sometimes, that order takes the form of someone not present to defend themselves. Police knocked on the door again. Still no answer. They tried calling the owner's name loudly. No one responded. An officer bent down to check the door gap, looked at the lock. Door locked. No signs of being broken. Nothing obligated them to act more forcefully. "We can't break down the door without grounds," someone said, tone neutral. That was the law. And the law doesn't change just because of a family's fear, but the law doesn't stop imagination. Leah looked at that door, and her heart raced. In her head, questions piled up, none with answers. What if Dakota is in there? What if someone's inside? What if... She stopped before the last thought could form, because she feared herself. A few neighbors began whispering more clearly, no longer vague statements. "Why isn't he here right at this time? Why do police knock but no one answers?" Those questions didn't aim to find answers. They aimed to find an object to pour their worries onto. John heard it and felt a simmering anger. He didn't know who lived in that apartment. He had no evidence. But he also couldn't stop himself from thinking, if that were my child, what would I do? That question pulled him toward the worst assumptions, though he hated himself for it. Police continued working by procedure. They noted the apartment couldn't be contacted. They marked it. But then they moved on. No sealing tape, no breaking down the door, just a note in the notebook, a small detail among hundreds of others. And thus, in many people's minds, that apartment began bearing a role it never asked for, center of suspicion. Leah realized something painful. Fear was turning everyone into reluctant judges. No one said it outright, but their eyes lingered on that ground floor door longer than normal. The story of Dakota, instead of just revolving around finding the child, began sliding toward finding someone to blame. She wondered if she was doing the same thing. Whether she was looking at that door with the mistaken hope that, if she could assign this pain to someone, everything would be easier to understand. John tried to keep his mind clear. He asked police what more they could do. The answer remained the same. They need time, need information, need to follow procedure. Those words sounded very reasonable, but in the ears of a father who's lost his son, they sounded like delays. Time passed. The sun rose high. Temperature increased. The once quiet apartment complex was now full of footsteps, soft voices, constant glances. And that ground floor door remained closed, silent, still an unanswered question. Leah suddenly realized a bitter irony. The absence of a person was becoming more noticeable than the disappearance of a child. While everyone tried to piece scattered fragments together, they were building a story that seemed logical, had a clear subject, had direction. But that story was based on something very fragile. Fear. Police left that door to continue work elsewhere, but in John and Leah's minds, the image of that unanswered apartment remained. It hung like a big question mark, without answer, unable to push aside. And in the silence of that closed door, a dangerous assumption had been anchored, that the answer to Dakota's disappearance might lie behind a door no one could open. When the ground floor door didn't provide answers, the search direction began shifting, naturally but also dangerously. Instead of continuing to revolve around what had been checked in the apartment complex, people began looking outside, farther out, wider. And by instinct, they turned to the most familiar place in this type of disappearance: open space. The woods behind Stafford Lakes quickly became the focus. It was there, right next to the complex, a dense green patch, evoking every fear parents have ever thought of. Police began building the assumption: if Dacota went out on his own, if he got down the stairs, then the next logical step was to go straight into the woods. No one said this was the only assumption, but the way people acted showed they believed it most. Search teams were mobilized, not just local police, but fire departments, volunteers, and later federal units. Hundreds of people lined up in formation, spread out by pattern, sweeping every meter of ground. Walkie-talkie voices constantly rang out, mixed with heavy breathing from the heat. Temperature rose quickly, air thick, as if the weather itself was adding pressure. John and Leah were swept up in that pace. When you see hundreds of people searching for your child, you don't question their direction. You trust they know what they're doing. You trust that if there's even the smallest chance, it lies ahead, not behind, not where you've stood for hours. Leah watched volunteers covered in sweat and dirt, and felt gratitude mixed with fear. Each of them was a sign that Dacota mattered. But at the same time, each step deeper into the woods also pulled her son's story farther from the apartment, away from where she'd woken up and realized the loss. Police began asking questions in a new direction. They asked if Dacota liked going outside. Had he ever run out of the house before? Was he afraid of strangers? Those questions weren't accusatory, but they gradually painted a picture. A curious child who could leave on his own, could get lost in a dangerous environment before anyone could stop him. John heard it and felt a different confusion rising. If everyone believed Dacota went into the woods, then that meant time was against them. Hot sun, no water, no one seeing him. That thought made him breathless. Media appeared. Cameras, microphones, quick, urgent questions. Do you have any message to send? Where do you think your son is? Leah tried to speak, but her throat choked up. Each answer seemed to freeze some assumption in listeners' minds, and she wasn't sure if she was helping or inadvertently leading the story further. Meanwhile, the apartment complex gradually became quieter. Not because fear disappeared, but because attention had moved away. Fewer people standing in the hallway. Fewer whispers. All eyes poured toward the woods, toward the roads leading out. The ground floor door, once the center of suspicion, was now just a detail on the checked list. John realized this change slowly. He stood at the edge of the search area, looking back at the complex, then looking at the formation advancing deeper. Part of him wanted to go back, wanted to ask if there were any apartments not thoroughly checked, wanted to mention the door no one opened. But the other part, the part driven by fear, said that if his son was out there, every passing minute could be the last. And so, without any official decision, the search had been pulled outside. Not because the inside had been resolved, but because the outside provided a clearer sense of action. Going farther always feels like doing something. Staying, looking at what's familiar requires patience, and doubting one's own assumptions. Leah sat in a police car for a while, looking through glass fogged from heat. She saw people with search dogs walk past, heard someone talking about scent trails. Everything sounded very professional, very serious. But in her heart, a small question still wouldn't disappear. If everyone's looking outside, then who's looking back inside? That question wasn't big enough to stop an entire campaign, not strong enough to change the direction that had formed. It only existed as an uncomfortable feeling, suppressed by walkie-talkie sounds, shoes stomping on dry leaves, and the belief that the answer must lie out there far away. And while the search continued expanding, meter by meter, round by round, the gap where the story began remained. not examined more closely, not dug deeper, simply left behind as something done. John and Leah didn't know this at the time. They only knew their son still hadn't been found, and that everyone was going very far to find a child. While the first question, how did he leave the apartment, still had no answer. When the search had spread beyond the apartment complex, work inside continued, but at a much slower and quieter pace. Police returned to the buildings, following familiar procedure. Knock on doors, identify themselves, ask quickly, take notes. Most doors opened immediately. Some people still sleepy, some worried more than necessary, some just shook their heads. All the same in one way. No one had seen Dacota. John followed a group of police for a few minutes, then stopped. He didn't want to watch them knock on more doors. Each time a door opened and closed without news, the feeling of disappointment repeated. Not dramatic, but wearing. Leah sat on the stairs, both arms hugging her knees, watching people pass by like in an unclear dream. The knock and talk procedure went smoothly, almost mechanically. Police didn't stay long before any apartment. They asked, noted, then left. Places where no one answered were marked as unable to contact and left. No ceiling tape, no breaking down doors, no arguments. The law was the law, and the law set very clear boundaries. The ground floor door, the door that had attracted many eyes that morning, was knocked on again. Still no answer. Lock still intact. No signs to allow crossing the line. The officer stood there a few seconds, exchanged quick words with colleagues, then took notes. Then they left, leaving the hallway quiet as if nothing had happened. To outsiders, that was a reasonable decision. To John and Leah, it was just one more thing they couldn't control. Leah watched the police officers' backs fade away, feeling a frustration hard to name. Not because someone did wrong, but because everything was operating by procedure, while her son was nowhere. Time passed slowly in a very strange way. No explosive moments, just stretching. News from the woods was constantly updated. This team finished sweeping that area. That team was expanding the search circle. That information sounded positive, but didn't bring the only thing John and Leah needed. Inside the apartment complex, work repeated until it became invisible. Some neighbors began returning home. Initial curiosity gave way to fatigue. They'd answered questions, helped as they could. Life, though disrupted, continued. That made Leah hurt in a very private way. To her, time had stopped from the moment she didn't see Dacota on the living room floor. To others, it just slowed down a bit. John tried to keep himself busy. He went up and down floors, asking again questions he knew wouldn't have new answers. Each time standing before a closed door, he felt a familiar helplessness. Not because he suspected anyone specific, but because of the feeling that there were spaces he couldn't enter, though that was where his son might have passed through. Police began compiling information. The list of checked apartments grew longer. The list of places unable to contact was shorter, but also not erased. It sat there, like a subset of data, unresolved, not prioritized. In a rapidly expanding campaign, details that don't shine are often pushed down. Leah heard someone say that if they talked to the complex's lawyer, they might get permission to check more thoroughly. But those procedures needed time, and time was what they felt they didn't have. She looked at the clock, then looked at sunlight slanting into the hallway, felt the temperature seemed to rise every hour. That sense of urgency made any delay unacceptable, though no one deliberately caused it. When afternoon came, the apartment complex almost returned to a quiet state. Not many people standing gathered. Police cars still there, but moving less. The focus had completely shifted outside. The doors inside, opened and closed, were considered done. John stood on the steps, looking toward the distant woods, then turned back to look at the pale painted doors before him. He didn't think in words, just a heavy feeling, as if something very close was being missed, not because anyone didn't care, but because no one had a strong enough reason to stop longer. Leah stood beside him, silent. She no longer had strength to say more. Every movement now was slow and heavy, like walking in deep water. Inside the apartment complex, doors continued standing there, closed, silent, lawful. By the end of the first day, the feeling of exhaustion had spread throughout Stafford. Lakes in a quiet but heavy way. No more initial chaos, no more densely gathered groups of people. Instead was a prolonged, tense state, as if everything had been held at a midpoint, not completely collapsed, but also no clear hope to cling to. John and Leah barely ate anything. Food was brought, from neighbors, from volunteers, but lay untouched on the table. Each time seeing a plate of food, Leah thought of Dacota, and nausea rose up. She couldn't imagine where her child was, how he was doing, while she sat here, facing a meal. Night fell very slowly. Spotlight beams from police cars still swept across the parking lot, but foot traffic thinned. The search continued out there, in the woods, along the roads, but to John and Leah, everything seemed separated from them. News came in small pieces, incoherent. This area checked, that area no results yet. Those statements repeated until they lost meaning. Leah sat in the back of a police car for a very long time, just to avoid looking into the empty apartment. Each time she went back there, she saw a new detail that made her heart clench. The plastic cup Dacota liked to use, a toy lying under the chair, small handprint on the table. Those things didn't change, but in this context, they were like fragments of evidence of a life just interrupted. John tried to keep himself awake. He talked to anyone willing to talk, not because he had more information, but because silence was too frightening. When not talking, his mind filled the gap with images he didn't want to see. Each passing minute stretched, measured not by clock, but by tension in his chest. On the second day, media appeared more. Cars bearing familiar logos parked along the road into the complex. Microphones extended, cameras turned on. John and Leah were asked if they wanted to say anything. They answered by instinct, repeating what they'd said before. No new news to share, just the same old worry growing heavier. Pressure began pressing from all sides. Police under pressure from the community. Family under pressure from waiting. Volunteers, after a nearly sleepless night, began exhausting. Temperature didn't drop much, air still thick and hard to breathe. Every movement cost more energy than normal. Leah realized something that frightened her more than initial speculation. The silence. No call from walkie-talkies announcing they'd found something. No sudden announcement making everyone run in one direction. Just a prolonged gap where all possibilities existed simultaneously. And in that gap, the human mind tends to slide toward the worst scenarios. John began feeling guilt in a very specific way. He recalled every small detail from the night before. Sleeping position, blanket location, not carrying Dacota to the bedroom. Those memories repeated without order, but always led to the same feeling. I was there, and I didn't see something. That feeling was big enough without anyone mentioning it. A few neighbors stopped by, saying familiar, comforting words. Everything will be okay. Police are doing their best. John nodded, thanked them, but those words slipped past him without leaving a trace. At this point, words no longer had much value. Only results mattered. The afternoon of the second day passed heavier than the first day. Everyone had hoped that if there was no bad news, at least there would be some progress. But when the sun began setting low without anything changing, a feeling of quiet failure spread. No one said it, but everyone understood that time wasn't on their side. Leah sat next to John, both saying nothing. Not because they ran out of things to say, but because every sentence led to the same place. She gripped his hand tightly, as a reflex, not to find comfort, but to make sure at least one thing in her life was still there. When the number 41 hours was mentioned, in reports, in exchanges, it didn't carry mathematical meaning. It was a psychological milestone. A period long enough for hope to become fragile, but not enough to let go. People still continued searching, still continued waiting, but with a new caution, heavier. John looked around the apartment complex once more. Nothing had changed. Doors still standing. Hallway still lit. Everything seemed to be pretending this was just another normal day. But to him and Leah, it was already a completely different period of time. A period measured by fear, waiting, and the prolonged absence of a child not yet found. The evening of the second day passed slowly beyond belief. No new announcements, no urgent car horns, no one running quickly in any direction. Everything seemed compressed, suspended in a state of wearing weight. John almost couldn't feel time clearly anymore. He only knew it had gotten dark, then darker, and lights in the apartment complex still on. Leah leaned back against the chair, eyes open but not really seeing anything. She'd cried too much in the past 2 days, to the point her body seemed to have no more water to continue. Instead was an empty, heavy feeling, as if all emotional reactions had been pressed down very deep. Around 9 at night, John stood up to go outside for a bit to breathe. He didn't go far, just circled the familiar parking lot, where he'd passed countless times since everything started. Night air gentler than daytime, but that coolness brought no relief. It just made him realize how exhausted he'd become. He was walking slowly when he saw a figure in the distance, near the walkway next to the building row. At first, he didn't pay attention. In the past 2 days, he'd seen too many figures. But then that figure moved closer, small, short, moving unevenly. John stopped. In the first moment, he didn't understand what he was seeing. His tired brain tried to assign that image to something familiar, but failed. Then he saw the wobbly walk, saw bare feet, saw the way that figure stopped, then walked again, as if uncertain where it was. His heart pounded so hard it made him dizzy. "Dacota?" he called, voice hoarse and small, as if afraid that speaking louder would make the image before him vanish. The figure froze. John didn't wait another second. He ran, not thinking about how much his legs hurt, not thinking he might be wrong. When he got close enough, all doubt collapsed at once. It was his son. Dirty, hair messy, no shirt, just the diaper that had shifted. But it was Dacota. John knelt down before the child, both hands shaking so much he almost couldn't touch the boy. "Where have you been all this time?" he said, voice completely broken. He hugged the child tight to his chest, as if just letting go a little, Dacota would disappear again. The call echoed throughout the apartment complex. Leah was the first to run out. When she saw the scene before her, John kneeling under the light, hugging a small child tight, she stood frozen for a second, as if her brain hadn't processed yet. Then she rushed over, knelt beside them, hand touching Dakota's back, his hair, his cheek continuously, as if to make sure this was real. She couldn't speak, just choked sounds. Broken. Police appeared almost immediately. Someone called on the walkie-talkie. Someone turned on a flashlight. But John and Leah barely noticed. Their entire world right now shrank to just 3 people, and Dakota's fast, uneven breathing. A police officer gently approached. "Is the child hurt anywhere?" he asked. Dacota didn't answer, just clung tight to John's shirt. That was enough to make Leah cry out loud, not from fear anymore, but from release. Dacota was taken into an ambulance for examination. John and Leah went with him. In the vehicle compartment, white light shone down on that small face. Medical staff checked quickly. Pulse, temperature, feet. There was a small cut, not serious. Otherwise, no signs of immediate danger. "The child is alert," someone said. "A bit dehydrated, but not severe." Leah lowered her head, tears flowing uncontrollably. John held her hand, clearly feeling himself trembling. But it was a different trembling. Not from fear, but from release coming too late, too suddenly. Police asked necessary questions. Where did the child appear from? Who saw first? Was anyone with him? John answered in a half-awake state. He only knew Dacota was here. Other details could come later. When the ambulance left, the apartment complex began buzzing again. News spread faster than any previous call. People gathered, whispered, breathed sighs of relief, couldn't hide their astonishment. A child disappeared for nearly 2 days, and then appeared on his own, almost right where everything started. But amid all that relief, there was another feeling forming. Slowly, hard to name. John and Leah hadn't said it yet. No one said it. But they all knew that Dakota's return didn't mean everything had been explained. Where had their son been for the past 41 hours? And how could an entire massive search campaign with hundreds of people have missed that answer right within reach? When the initial emotion settled, the story immediately turned another direction. No longer Dacota was found. But where was Dacota? In the ambulance, a police officer sat facing John and Leah, voice low and slow. He asked again very carefully, "Where exactly did Dacota appear? From which direction?" John described the location, the walkway next to the building row, right near the ground floor apartments. That detail made the officer's brow slightly furrow, but he said nothing yet. At the hospital, after confirming Dacota faced no serious danger, police continued working. They asked Dacota, of course only at a very simple level. Short questions, easy to understand. And from those broken, incomplete answers, the picture began appearing. Dacota couldn't say 41 hours, couldn't say apartment, but the boy could say a few familiar words. Cat, eat, toys. Those words, in this context, carried strange weight. An officer remembered a detail once noted, then overlooked, the ground floor apartment of the man who was away, where no one could be contacted. They went back there, this time not just knocking. The apartment owner, Norman Newton, had left before Dacota went missing, on vacation with family. He left the door unlocked so an acquaintance could come feed the cat. This detail, when pieced together with what Dacota said, suddenly became frighteningly clear. Police opened the door. Inside were no signs of violence, no traces of an unfamiliar adult. But there were other things, small, chaotic, very familiar to anyone who's raised young children. Toys pulled out of boxes, shaving cream sprayed all over the bathroom, a bottle of ink spilled on the floor. And in the kitchen, clear signs that someone had eaten the cat food. Small footprints faintly imprinted on the floor. No more doubt. Dacota had walked into that apartment on his own. And then, when the owner's acquaintance came to feed the cat, the door was locked, accidentally trapping the boy inside. John and Leah heard this story in an almost numb state. Not from shock, but from how everything was too simple. No kidnapper, no conspiracy, no mysterious neighbor. Just a series of very small, very ordinary things, stacked on each other in the right way. A 2-year-old wakes up. A door not locked, an empty apartment, a door locked from outside. 41 hours. Police called this a containment scenario, a situation where the child didn't go far, but also couldn't come back. A particularly dangerous type of disappearance, because it deceives search instinct. Everyone looked far away, while the answer lay right below. Leah listened with trembling hands. She didn't cry anymore. She just repeated one sentence very softly. He was right there, right in the same building, right below them. While hundreds of people sweated in the woods, her son was in an air-conditioned apartment, finding ways to survive by child instinct. John was silent. He wasn't angry at police, not angry at neighbors, not even angry at himself in the violent way he'd imagined. What he felt was the terrible fragility of safety. Just one very small decision, not locking a door, and one very familiar assumption, he must have gone outside, was enough for the entire system to go off course. Media immediately changed tone. From mystery, suspicion, kidnapping fear, shifted to lighter phrases. Miracle. Real life home alone. The story became something that could be told with a smile, but to John and Leah, it wasn't light at all. They understood that, without the air conditioning in that apartment, without the cat food, if Dakota panicked and cried loudly, the outcome could have been very different. Everything ended, but not the way they'd imagined. No culprit in handcuffs, no dramatic climax. Just a child found, and a truth that made people shudder because it was so ordinary. Dakota fell asleep on the hospital bed that night, hand holding Mom's shirt. Leah watched him sleep, and for the first time after 2 days, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, not because everything was okay, but because her child was here. As for John, when he stepped into the hospital hallway, looked down at the parking lot, he just thought one very simple thing. Sometimes, the scariest thing isn't intentional evil, but familiar assumptions, when everyone believes they're correct. When retelling the Dacota Hill case, what haunts me most isn't the 41 hours the child disappeared, but how all the adults around looked in the wrong direction together, in a very logical, very reasonable, and very human way. No one in this story did anything malicious. Parents just tired and fell asleep. Neighbor just left door open for the cat. Police followed proper procedure. Volunteers did their best. Media reflected the era's fears correctly. But precisely because everything was correct by familiar standards, the entire system slipped from the truth that quickly. This case showed me something very hard to accept. Humans don't seek truth first, we seek a reasonable story first. And when that story is convincing enough, any details that don't fit will be seen as secondary. A door that won't open, an apartment no one answers, an assumption that, if there was anything inside, we'd have heard. All were overlooked, not from ignorance, but because they didn't fit the story being believed. Dakota wasn't kidnapped. No suspicious neighbor, no stranger. But precisely because of that, the boy's story became more frightening. It showed that in emergency situations, danger doesn't just come from the unusual, but also from things too familiar. If this were a criminal case, perhaps it would be easier to tell. There'd be a climax, a villain, a clear ending. But this isn't that. This is a lesson about blind spots, where the entire community, the entire system, together didn't look because they thought, it's definitely not there. When media called this real-life Home Alone, I understand why they said that. But to me, this isn't a happy story. It's a cold reminder that, in life-or-death moments, sometimes the most dangerous thing is collective confidence that you're looking in the right place. Dakota surviving is a rare stroke of luck. But if we only stop at the word miracle, we'll miss something far more important. The child didn't go anywhere, it's just that adults went too far from where they needed to look most. And that's why, Though this case has no criminal in the traditional sense, it's still one of the most thought-provoking missing person stories I've ever told. If Dacota Hill's story makes you feel uneasy, doubtful, or have to pause and think, then that's exactly why I told it this way. Leave a comment. What do you think was the biggest mistake in this search? Like the video if you want to hear more real missing person cases, where the truth doesn't lie with the bad guy, but in human blind spots. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, told slowly, carefully, and not relying on shadowy suspects for easy viewing. Sometimes understanding a case doesn't help us feel more at ease, but it helps us look in the right place when the worst happens. See you in the next story.